Hello and welcome to this episode of Bake It Up a Notch. I'm Erin McDowell and I am so excited today to talk to you about a very special tradition in the McDowell family, sugar cookies. Now, for a lot of people, making and decorating sugar cookies is a tradition associated with the holidays, but in my family, it's something that we always did in the springtime. It's a really fun way to bring a little bit of color into your kitchen towards the end of winter, but honestly, it's a great baking project any time of year, and I can't wait to dive into it today. If you like royal icing, please be sure to click like and subscribe so you can get in on all the cookie action. First things first, let's talk about the equipment. We went over all this same equipment when we did our rollout gingerbread cookie episode in December. We've got an electric mixer with the paddle attachment for mixing the dough, small offset spatulas, a rolling pin, I've got a pastry wheel, a paring knife. You're gonna use all those same tools and equipment today in this episode. All right, once you get all your equipment together, you can get your ingredients and let's get baking. This recipe is going to use the creaming method. We've gone over that a lot before, but I'm going to talk a little bit about how it applies specifically to this cookie recipe as we dive in. When it comes to roll out cookies, the mixture is a little bit firmer. That's really one of the main things that's different about a drop and scoop cookie. So we're going to start with our butter. It's very important in this recipe that the butter is at room temperature. In the winter or cooler months, your butter, even at room temperature, might be a little bit too firm. One of the things that I do if I'm not sure that my butter is decidedly at room temperature is I put it into the microwave still wrapped in its paper and just for 5 to 10 seconds. It really does an amazing job of softening the whole stick, but you have to be really, really delicate, just a little bit of time in the microwave to help bring it to that softer texture. Now, usually what I say to do when you're doing the creaming method is go ahead and put your butter in the mixing bowl with your paddle attachment and just mix it. Give it a few rotations on the mixer to help let that butter break up and get into a nice soft consistency before we add the sugar. Now I'm gonna go ahead and add my granulated sugar into the bowl. And this is really what the creaming method is named for. The act of creaming the butter and sugar together. And it's really gonna contribute to the final texture of the baked good. I usually cream on more of a medium speed. That's a funny sentence taken out of context. Sorry. Now, one of the most important things with the creaming method is to remember to scrape. Scrape the sides of the bowl, but especially the very bottom of your mixing bowl. Stuff loves to hide down there and not get incorporated. We want everything to be homogeneous. Once this mixture is really nice and light and fluffy, now it's time to add our egg. This recipe just calls for 1 large egg. After we mix to incorporate it, we're gonna wanna give the bowl another really good scrape. It honestly is one of the biggest differences between your bake turning out really evenly and uniform and turning out a little bumpy. It's really, really important, especially in something simple like sugar cookies. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Scrape your bowl good. The next thing we need to add is some vanilla extract. We can remember what my friend Evan said. You can measure the vanilla with your heart or you can use a teaspoon, which is what this recipe calls for. We'll just give a little extra. All right, now let's mix together our dry ingredients. Just a few things going on here. We've got all-purpose flour, baking powder, some fine sea salt, and ground cinnamon. Now, this is optional. You could leave this out. I just usually do a pinch of this. The reason that I like to add a little bit of cinnamon into my sugar cookie base, I had a sugar cookie recipe passed down to me by my great-great-grandma. It's actually also here on Food 52, called Great-Grandma McCracken's Sugar Cookies. And her sugar cookies have several little bits of spice in them. They have a little bit of cinnamon, a little bit of clove, and a little bit of nutmeg. They mostly just taste like a sugar cookie, but there's just this little bit of depth, and anyone who eats them is kind of like, oh, what is that? And it just gives this warmth. It's lovely, makes them smell great while they're baking. You can totally leave it out. I kind of do it as an homage to my great-great-grandma. So we're gonna go ahead and add these dry ingredients in. So I'm just gonna add about half of it. Mix that to combine first, and then I'll incorporate the rest of the flour and we'll mix until a smooth dough forms. So a really good indicator that this dough is done is when it sort of self-cleans the mixing bowl and forms a ball around the paddle. It's not gonna be like a perfect ball, but it actually reminds me very similarly to the pickup stage of bread mixing, where it sort of towards the end is going to pick up all the things on the side of that bowl as it becomes more homogeneous. So you can see that here. You can also see it here. Now, once this dough comes out, you can break it into a few different pieces, or you can chill it just as one large block. Remember, smaller pieces of dough are gonna be easier to roll out. So if you're somebody who struggles with rolling, or if you're working with kids, because this is a fun kid baking project, you might wanna go ahead and divide it into a few different pieces. We're just gonna go ahead and form this into an even thickness, about an inch thick, and then wrap it tightly in some plastic wrap or beeswax wrap, whatever you've got, and then we're gonna go ahead and transfer it to the refrigerator to chill until it's nice and firm. This might be ready as early as 30 minutes, but this chilling is not only about refirming the fat in the recipe, it's also about relaxing some of the gluten, so it's going to be a little bit easier for us to roll out this dough. So remember, at least 30 minutes. I usually leave it for an hour or two, or sometimes I even make the dough the day before I want to roll out and bake my cookies. Our dough is chilled, now it's time to roll it out now. This dough has been chilling actually since yesterday, so it's pretty firm. Now, unlike pie dough, which I roll out straight from the refrigerator, and it should be plenty malleable and all that good stuff, these doughs are a little bit firm when they first come out of the refrigerator. You can handle it a few different ways. You can pull it out of the refrigerator and leave it at room temperature for just 5 minutes or so. You can kind of warm it using your hand by just going around the whole disc of dough that you created. Or you can do what we learned in pastry school, which is also a really good way to get out any pent-up aggression you have inside of you. We can use our rolling pin to hit it a few times. It's really a special, versatile cookie dough. If you roll out this dough thin, and bake it until you see an even level of browning, the cookies will be quite crisp. But if you roll out this dough a little bit thicker and underbake it just slightly until you only see a tiny bit of color around the outside edge, it will be a soft, not crispy, crunchy edged cookie. I'm gonna show you some of this later when we talk about the baking of these cookies, and you can see a few different levels of bake and see how it really does change the texture. Okay, my dough is back together. I'm gonna go ahead and roll out this dough on a lightly floured surface. Now, I've talked about before other ways of rolling out dough. We rolled out my gingerbread cookie dough between 2 pieces of parchment paper, which also makes it very easy. You don't have to transfer the cut cookies to your parchment-lined baking sheet. You can just slide the whole parchment over. And you can also use something like a non-stick pastry mat here. I just roll it out on a lightly floured surface. A smooth surface is best. What I've got here is I have my 5-2 rolling pin, and it's got these little guides, and they're just gonna kind of let me know when I reach the right thickness. Now I got some cracks going on here. Just pinch them together. Make sure there's not a ton of extra flour anywhere that you do that, and then put your pin over it to just help flatten those back out. All right, I think I'm in a good place to start going ahead and cut out some cookies from my first little bit of dough. Now, this dough can be re-rolled as many times as you need. The texture and even the color might change a tiny bit as you start to get into the 4th, 5th, 6th rollout of this dough. But I'm also gonna show you something really fun you can do with scraps, or you can do it right out from the get-go if you want. We'll talk about that a little later when we're making it pretty. Before you cut out your cookies, lift up the dough, even slide your spatula underneath it if you're too afraid to lift it up like I just did. Because now we know that that dough is not stuck to the surface. So in addition to flouring the cutter, I wanna make sure that the dough isn't stuck to my work surface before I even start cutting. So when you press a cookie cutter in, we wanna just press straight down with the cookie cutter. When you've got something round, like a round cutter, people have this tendency to wiggle it around. And when you wiggle it around, you don't make nice straight edges, and you could end up with little clumps or crumbles. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take all my excess away, leaving only the cut cookies behind. So I'm just gonna ball up all this extra dough. Like I said, most of these should just pick right up off the work surface because we already made sure it wasn't adhered before we started. But if it is feeling stuck for any reason, you're gonna wanna just enlist the help of your offset spatula. You can just use that to slide underneath and lift your cookie up. I'm gonna transfer these to a parchment-lined baking sheet. Sugar cookies, in this recipe specifically, do not spread very much. If you're trying to bake a lot of batches, if it's the holidays and you're really trying to maximize the amount you're baking at a time in your oven, it's okay to let them get a little bit closer. The main thing you want to be aware of is you still want air to be able to get all around those cookies for even browning and even kind of heat distribution. So if you've got room on the baking sheet, give them some breathing room even though they're not going to spread. So I'm gonna go ahead and bake this tray. These cookies bake at 350 degrees. You're gonna wanna bake them until you see just a slight bit of browning around the outside edge if you're wanting that softer bake, or you can bake them until they're a little bit golden brown, even on the top for that crisper bake. All right, into the oven they go. Okay, so these cookies just came out of the oven. When we first put this dough into the oven, it looks sort of dry. Then the heat of the oven sort of immediately takes effect and makes the cookie look shiny. As the cookie continues to bake, it's going to become more matte and set across the surface. You can see that on these cookies, that it's really evenly so across the surface. If you ever see a little bit of shininess, that's usually a good indicator that a portion of the cookie is still a little underbaked. If you're baking multiple trays at a time, be sure to rotate your trays during baking. Rotate both the top tray and the bottom tray, and also rotate the trays front to back, just to make sure that you're getting even circulation about halfway through the baking process. Once you reach your desired level of doneness, the cookies can cool down right on the baking sheet. If you ever feel like you've taken it a little bit too far, you can actually gently remove your cookies onto a cooling rack. Because if they are a little bit too crispy, they're going to continue to get a little bit firmer just due to the retained heat of the baking sheet. Okay, let's talk about some of the mistakes that can happen in this sugar cookie recipe. Mistakes happen, but luckily cookie mistakes are usually still very delicious. One is when your cookies spread too much or grow together. If you notice that your cookies are spreading, it could be an indicator that you need to chill your dough or that your oven temperature is off. Now, when that happens, take the paring knife and guide it around the cookies. These cookies are still pretty malleable when they are warm. Another thing that can happen is uneven browning. Uneven browning can happen when your dough's thickness isn't even, so again, enlist the help of those guides if you need them. A thinner piece of dough is gonna become browner and crisper faster than a thicker piece. But it can also happen due to hot spots in your oven, not properly rotating the pans. If you want to avoid things like that, put less cookies on your total baking sheet so that they have more air circulation between them. So these 3 sets of cookies in front of me kind of show the 3 different bake areas you can take this to. The blondest here on this end will be the softest cookie, and it only has very light browning around the outside edge. If you take the browning a little bit more so that it's starting to come onto the surface of the cookie, you're gonna have something that's kind of in the middle. And over here, if you take it and let the whole thing brown really evenly, you're gonna have a very crisp, crumbly, crunchy cookie. Also tasty, especially with icing on top. Then over here we have arguably the smallest problem. This mistake is air bubbles. If you notice a little air bubble before or during the early stages of baking, you can just use the tip of a paring knife to gently pierce the pocket of air to release it, and as it bakes, it's going to kind of flatten back out. But if you don't notice it until after the cookie is set, there's not much you can do about it, and unfortunately, those little bubbles and imperfections might show up as ripples underneath your icing, preventing your icing from looking totally smooth. So it is something good to keep an eye out for, and also when you're picking your most perfect cookies, maybe these are the ones you snack on while you wait for the other ones to be done. All right, let's talk about some ways to fancy up your cookies and make them really pretty. One of my favorite ways to make sugar cookies pretty actually has nothing to do with any kind of frosting or topping at all. It's just marbling different colors of cookie dough before baking to produce a really cool effect. When you make this chocolate dough, you just take out a portion of the flour. All the details are in the recipe, and you just add in a little bit of cocoa powder with the other dry ingredients. Here I used just a standard Dutch cocoa powder in this recipe, which produces this kind of, more warm brown chocolate color. But here I used one of my favorite ingredients, black cocoa, which produces this really beautiful, intense color. I have that, and I also have some scrap vanilla dough from before. So now to marble these cookies, what I like to do is break it into little individual pieces and build a block, smushing them together. and then we can knead it a few times to bring it together, or you can just start rolling it out. The more you knead it and mix it, the more marbled it will become. But remember, that also means that eventually it's just gonna all combine to the point where you won't really get that streaky effect. Now, once it's all in there, you can just kind of smush it and then give it a couple kneads. This is a fun thing for kids because there's really no right or wrong way. It's basically edible chocolate and vanilla Play-Doh we've got here. So we'll just roll it out the same way we rolled out our regular cookies. You can also use food coloring to help dye the plain vanilla dough different colors and create a similar marble effect. I have a friend who's actually going to be a guest on a future episode of Bake It Up a Notch who makes her shortbread this way. She marbles multiple colors together and kind of sees what comes out. So, so beautiful. So now when it comes to cutting out this dough, normally I'm very focused on cutting cookies really close to one another to maximize the rollout. But in this case, what I like to do is just look for my favorite parts, then smush it all together and roll it out again and see what the next stage of marbling brings. After baking, you can see how cool these cookies look. No two of them are alike. If you're looking for more ways to decorate your cookies without using any frosting, you can apply other things before baking to the cookies. A little brush of egg white or even just a little bit of water will help ingredients like coconut, pearl sugar, sanding sugar, or sprinkles stick to the surface of your cookie during baking, and then when you're done, you have an already decorated cookie without even ever having to whip out a pastry bag. When I decorate sugar cookies with my mom, we would always finish them with royal icing. Now, we dove in deep on royal icing in one of our bite-sized episodes last year, but here's a little refresher on some of the things you need to know. The right consistency is the most important thing when it comes to royal icing. There's a stiffer consistency that really even holds peaks, and that can be used to pipe more textural work, like even shell borders and rounded pearls on the top of your cookies. Then there's a piping consistency where it's loose enough that it will flow easily out of the bag, but it's also going to hold a line. Then you also have flooding consistency, which sometimes is a little bit thinner than that piping consistency, just to make sure you can really get a nice even coating in the center and that it will have that totally flat, pristine look on the outside. Now remember, the thinner the royal icing is, the longer it's going to take for it to set. So if you're working with a flooding consistency, be sure to let those cookies set completely before adding any effects on to the top. Another thing I like to remind people that I do is I always have a skewer handy. This is both helpful for popping air bubbles, but also for guiding the icing to where you want it to go when you're flooding, so that you don't risk overfilling or overflooding the cookie and having it drip off the sides. You can also place your skewer in the center of your cookie and kind of shake back and forth. It helps the icing to level out and become smooth all across the cookie. It just gives it that little bit of guiding force to do so. So today I just want to show you, just for fun, some other techniques you can do with royal icing. One of my favorites is to decorate with royal icing by flooding, and while it's still wet, dip it or sprinkle it with sparkling sugar. This gives an incredible texture, and it also still keeps the hue of your icing behind it for a really cool looking cookie that also happens to be really simple to achieve. I'm also going to show one of my favorite techniques, which is called the brush technique. In the brush technique, you apply either dots or thin lines of royal icing, and then you use a slightly damp brush to drag the icing downward. It creates a really beautiful texture that's sort of like lace. It's great for flowers, it's great for all sorts of effects, and it's going to look so pretty on my cookies today. There are no shortage of ways you can decorate your sugar cookies, but I did just want to share a few ideas for making it pretty, and now I want to see all the creative ideas you have. What's your favorite way to decorate sugar cookies? Let us know in the comments. A lot of people think of royal icing as the icing of choice when decorating sugar cookies, but I also love to use buttercream. Buttercream is a little bit thicker and fluffier, and in some ways it's a little bit easier to manipulate because you can just throw it right on with a spatula, or you can even bring out your piping bag and tips and add some fancy effects. Whenever I think of buttercream topped cookies, I always think of those soft cookies that are almost cake-like. They're very nostalgic for me and I love them. So that's what I wanted to do with this recipe, which is my Sprinkle Splosion cookie recipe. This recipe is a little bit different than our rollout sugar cookies, which I love. But don't get me wrong, I also love a cakier, softer drop cookie. It uses the creaming method just as our rollout cookie dough does, so mixing it looks pretty similar. The only difference is in the ratio. Rollout cookie dough has a higher ratio of flour so that we can more easily manipulate it and it's not as sticky of a dough. Then when they come out of the oven and cooled, I'm gonna top them with buttercream and of course, more sprinkles. So remember, royal icing isn't the only frosting when it comes to sugar cookies. Buttercream is tasty too. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Bake It Up a Notch, where we dove deep into sugar cookies. This is such a fun and special tradition in the springtime in my family, and if it inspires you to bake, I would love to see what you are making. Please use hashtag Bake It Up a Notch, tag me, show me your creations. I would love to see them. As always, all of these delicious recipes are available on food52.com and linked in the video description below. Please be sure to come back for our next episode where I'm inspired by some kiddos to make some very special creations. And until then, happy baking. Usually what I say to do is just mix the butter. I'm gonna need to plug in my mixer again.
Sorry.